Hi, Maskull. Thank you for joining me from Vancouver.
Yeah, just north of Vancouver. We're in Squamish, yeah. I guess I've been out here sort of 7 or 8 years now, so I've got quite a bit of public work already, sort of in the lower mainland here. Yeah, I mean, there's a good appetite for public sculpture, and I guess the 1% for art policy, or the support of developers to kind of contribute something to the public space it's a good opportunity, and it's nice to get a little bit of work out there. It's nice to make something that has a permanent public home, sort of in design and execution.
Your work is very intense work. Despite the fact that you were leaning so much on the Eastern philosophy, your artwork actually revealed a turmoil inside you.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, conflict and constraint are generative forces. It's nice to play one thing off against another. I mean, we see and hear and understand by contrasts and oppositions or dialectics. There's always a conversation is a conflict in a way, and I mean, a lot is revealed in those interactions. You learn a lot about something by how it fails. So I think my work likes to push the boundary to when a concept or a material approaches that point where it can no longer hold up. And I think very, very interesting things are revealed about its nature at that kind of critical moment. I try to move that through also into the public realm. You engineer something very carefully and you make use of the innate sort of structural materials of or properties of a material, and it reveals it in ways that aren't typically used in the public sphere. And it just, I mean, that conflict or that tension, I think, is generative in terms of sort of the conversation within the work, but also the conversation it encourages, hopefully. That little bit of discomfort causes people to take sides to some extent. Yeah.
The past 8 years, with you working in Afghanistan, the themes change, your thinking changed. It shows in your artwork as instruments, as books, in so many forms.
It's true that experience in Afghanistan definitely separated my life. I think as I've probably said before, into a before and after. I mean, life was a game before that experience, and then after that it became serious. You experience something that has a level of necessity that a lot of us have the luxury of not enduring in everyday comfortable existence. But to encounter something, especially through the lens of my work, that had absolute necessity or consequence, has definitely changed my relationship to some extent with my work and sort of my purpose on this planet in a way. There are people who live lives doing something for which everything is dependent, and if I'm not engaged in the work that I do on a similar level of intensity, then I feel a little bit like I'm wasting my time. So I mean, in some ways it put big air quotes art and artistic creation in its place, but also revealed itself as something that can be very serious and intentional and consequential for me personally. And I mean, I don't mean to project that out on anyone else's experience, but I very much make from a place that has that additional understanding of what human engagement with the world can be. So that has definitely contributed a flavor and an intensity, I think, to my work and my understanding. I'd never say it was a pleasant experience, but I'm very, very grateful for it.
A lot of your work has these Hamlet Shakespearean undertones, like conscience.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And again, this is probably something I've said previously, but I'm tremendously kind of selfish with the work that I make. My relationship to it and its value is kind of calculated in terms of what I can learn through the creation of it. I think mostly through my hands, and it's nice for me to have this interlocutor, this material physical authority outside of my mind that I get to have these conversations or very productive conflicts with. Boxing is another good analogy from my life experience. A conflict in a ring brings the best out of both participants in a way, and I think my work is very much in that vein. I try to bring the best out of the material or the concepts that I'm orchestrating in this physical entity, and it hopefully brings the best out of me at the same point through that interaction. So it's a tremendously personal conversation that then bears the residue of a final work of art, right? And then that residue, that kind of accidental object that is the product of this very personal process, is what ends up kind of falling out into the world, and sometimes they find homes and sometimes they don't, but in many ways that's sort of accidental to really what's important to me.
Wood seems to be your favorite medium. You're giving wood so many forms, for example, in Dismal Land or Decoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I think it's the limitless kind of information or resolution floor of analog systems. I mean, we live so much in this digital realm of kind of you can't get beyond the zeros and the ones, and there's a wonderful sophistication but also a simplicity to that. But when I have this kind of archaeological response to a piece of wood that no one has ever seen the inside of, who knows what's in there? Who knows what idiosyncrasies exist in the grain or the formation, or pieces that have been eaten by shipworm because they've been floating in the ocean for the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, it's a wonderful process of discovery, again, into another living system, another kind of biological structure that is tremendously rich, and there's kind of an intuitive permission that wood gives to take the form of these other subjects. Like the subject is kind of the question that I ask the material, and then the sculpture is the response that it kind of gives back to me through our conversation. Living in the Pacific Northwest, I am surrounded by these magnificent old growth trees, but also these industrial landscapes that at first look natural, but really have been logged for generations. So there's a very interesting intertwining of the human endeavor with these biological systems, and we've reached maybe an uneasy equilibrium, but it's fertile ground to dig into and explore kind of in a contemplative way with my tools. Those are sort of the thoughts that I have when I dig into these things. These pieces really exist deeply through time and history and evolution. They come out as these still static objects, but really they have a very kind of profound temporal origin.
Your trajectory kind of zigzagged. You were born in Alberta, then you moved to Africa, then you went to New Brunswick, Montreal, Vancouver. It was not a linear trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, thank goodness. The thing I'm most grateful to for my work is, I guess, just that it has moved me around so much. I mean, those are definitely the longest sojourns I've had in any one place. But I've been very, very fortunate, to live in New York for a while, and in San Francisco, and in other places too. So yeah, it's what my work has contributed to my well-being, is this very interesting life experience that I would not have had if I hadn't followed it or chased it, or it's chased me around this planet a little bit. Straight lines aren't that interesting. I'm much more interested in the things that I don't yet know or don't understand. And I think the work that I do is a way for me to encounter that in a meaningful way and have a conversation with this nonlinear life experience. So I mean, as long as I have the energy for it, I'm very grateful for that circuitous kind of path to wherever it is that I find myself. This notion of art and artist, it's how much meaning can really be captured by a 3-letter word. It's a very mysterious and to some extent kind of uncomfortable notion for me, I think we do a very poor job kind of socially or culturally, at least in this epoch, understanding what it is to be an artist, much less what art actually is. And I think, I worked very hard at not really identifying myself as any one thing in particular, much less my son. But there is, I think the thing that word does contribute is an ambiguity or a mystery that allows a great deal of openness in terms of response to one's life and one's environment and one's society. There are wonderful mystical dimensions to what it is that I do that I never speak about. They have a reality in my private existence, and I very much hope for my son that he has a similar comfort and sort of wonder at the world around him, and that there's room and freedom for him to explore and to contribute in ways that are meaningful in some way. I don't know what other word I really have for it, but that notion of being in wonder at these few years that we get to enjoy this life before we disappear back into sort of physical identity with everything, it's a tremendous gift, and if I can share that a little bit through my work, and hopefully with him, it is a thread that I picked up very gratefully from my parents, and hopefully it's a thread that I can pass on to him and he can follow.
What are you working on right now?
Other than raising a 2-year-old, I like to have a lot of different projects at my fingertips, and I hop from one to the next depending on which one speaks to me. And again, I have the luxury of being able to do that, wander out into the studio and not have too many plans or too many external obligations that force me into the wrong type of work. I'm sort of at my best when I'm following the lead of some strange curiosity or imperative that comes from the tools on my workbench or a new piece of equipment that I have, and some of the other projects that are waiting for me to attend to them. Sometimes one speaks to me, and that's the one I jump into. But I work very hard at not having a schedule for this stuff. When they evolve in a natural kind of hunter-gatherer way, that's the most productive kind of interaction I can have with them. So I've got a number of public art projects, some relatively small, some very, very big, kind of in the pipeline right now. The larger ones are at fabricators sort of internationally, and my hands are clean on those. I make maquettes, digitize them, and then sort of expand them digitally to full size. So I'm speaking specifically about a project for the Lower Mainland here that's going to be installed in 2027, I guess. And then a couple smaller public artworks that I still have my hands in a little bit, the ones that are interesting and have good problems for me to solve, the kind of work that I haven't found anyone else who's able to do it the way I am, and I'm still really selfish with some aspects of the process. I enjoy the learning that comes through those struggles, so I can still afford to be selfish with hoarding those processes for me in my studio. And then there are the accidental, whimsical little flights of fancy that I indulge in, whether they're drawings or smaller sculptures or kind of a series of works that for as long as possible escape designation. Things start off as tools, kind of become art materials, and then maybe get folded back into a functional piece. And there's this very interesting kind of trajectory of materials and ideas that dip into different pools of meaning or understanding. Like it has a functional tool purpose, and that gets co-opted into an artwork, and then that artwork becomes a great base for something else for me to work on. Then there's an accident there, and there are these lovely, again, just accidents of evolution that I enjoy kind of capturing and hopefully get manifested in the pieces as they resolve. So the work, as I say, the most authentic, unimpeded work evolves as just accidents of me living, and those are the ones that are most interesting to me and have maybe the most curious ontology. And I think those are the ones that keep me doing this, because they are the ones that I understand the least. Yeah, it's interesting. drawing was probably the first thing that I did, and it's probably the last thing I'll do. I enjoy the full spectrum activity of sculpture just because it is so physical. And it's like mountaineering in a way. It uses every ounce of your physical reserves and your psychological reserves and your emotional reserves, intellectual, everything. It's this full body experience that it's exercise in ways that very few other things are. Drawing is a much more isolating undertaking, but it's way easier on your body, so I enjoy this physical stuff for as long as I can do it. I've got hopefully years of drawing stored up in my future when my back gives out and the rest of it. So drawing is also probably the most difficult thing that I do. There are stages in sculpture that just fundamentally do not get manifested in the final result. Like carving in particular. Carvings look awful until they look right. You have to carve through the ugly portions of it before they resolve into something that's meaningful and can stand alone, right? But a drawing, every single mark, again, I probably said this before, holds the DNA of the entire drawing in it. There's no hidden line, no mark that doesn't register in the final piece. So, in many ways, drawings are not started until they're finished. And there's kind of a parsimony or a delicacy. It's much closer to poetry than, other long forms of literature. You've got in a haiku, every word, every phrase, and in the telling of it, every pause matters. And drawings are like that. The DNA of that entire drawing exists in every mark that gets left on that page. And it is, I think, the language around drawing, especially again in a time when we are so image-based, to say nothing of recent, AI developments and the rest of it. The image has a dubious reputation, and I think it's difficult to look, especially, how many people see my drawings compared to those who see representations of them? When you look at a photograph, a recording of a sculpture, you never make the mistake of thinking that you're looking at the sculpture itself. But when you look at a picture of a drawing, it's easy to make the mistake in thinking that you've actually seen the drawing when you haven't. Again, drawings are just sculptures made of paper and dirt, and they are something, they have a tactility and an object quality that I think in many ways really makes them probably more frightening and interesting than sculptures are. But again, they're easily misunderstood in a time when everyone sees everything on one of these. You're not looking at a sculpture when you look at this, but sometimes it feels like you're looking like a drawing. So maybe it's more difficult for them to be spoken about meaningfully or encountered in an authentic way.
There is a sense of suspense when we are standing next to your art, because a lot of times it's hanging in a certain way and you're wondering, what if it's going to break or fall, because there's this big rock, this big piano. How do you manage to convey that feeling in your viewers?
Those kind of boundary conditions are the things that I really enjoy exploring. Again, opening that spectrum between, expectation, what is actually physically possible. The broader I can spread that gap, the more interesting the journey is for me, and probably the more interesting it is for the viewer. This analog between kind of the necessity of physical systems and the imperative of kind of poetic or metaphorical systems also, and I really like those. This notion of metaphor as a metaphor almost in itself, but the difference between the delicacy and the weight, or the strength and the fragility of these things, it's like a drawing. It's like contrast. It's like the white of the page and then the very, very dark shadow accomplished by a line. Opening these little pockets of experience or life or possibility for the viewer kind of to inhabit and explore is really what's interesting for me, only in that they are the pockets that I like opening and exploring and inhabiting a little bit, shedding some light on them, pushing pushing the boundary of what I think is possible. And this notion of failure or the edge of failure, the adjacent impossible, is a place where I really like to inhabit. Very, very interesting things happen at the limit of success and failure. And if I'm not skirting that line, life's not very interesting.
There's a duality in you. One of an explorer, an adventurer, and the other one is as a hermit.
I think in many ways it's kind of the same thing. Brian Eno was talking about, at some point there's a quote about him discussing two types of creative process, one being that of architecture and the other being that of gardening. Like the architect has an idea, builds to a plan, where a gardener kind of has their fingers in the ground, plants some ideas and sees what grows. I propose sort of a third mode, and that is that of the kind of hunter-gatherer. And I think I'm much more of that third type. I wander through this world out of necessity, largely kind of on my own or in my head. And the things that I come across, this notion of also just, I need to be a good listener. I listen for inspiration, and things that strike me as curious or needing development are much more akin to me tracking an animal, in terms of this hunter-gatherer mode than being a farmer, much less an architect. I court these ideas, I see the tracks of these ideas in the world somehow, and then I have to cultivate a trap or an environment that allows them to come back to me, feel comfortable, so I can get to know them, and if not hunt them, at least domesticate them to the extent that they can abide in one of my drawings or my sculptures. So this notion of a hermit or an explorer, I think they're not by any means two sides of a coin. I think they're very close to the same end of the spectrum. My community, and probably until fairly recently my family, was my tools and my materials.
The hunter-gatherer dichotomy shows in your art a lot. For example, in chair traps, objects that are supposed to give us comfort, they look so predatory.
Yeah, that's right. Things need to constitute both sort of an invitation and a warning. But isn't the whole world like that, in a way? Trying to call back to some fundamental human experience where the world, there's all this conversation about safety, and the world has never been a safe place. We're never safe. There's always risk. I'm not sure when we deviated and lost all appetite for anything really interesting or consequential. And I think this goes back to this kind of navigational beacon that I found and left in Afghanistan. There is tremendous difficulty and suffering that calls on the human condition to really bolster itself and become the best thing it can be, or else it's going to become the worst thing it can be, and hopefully these works that have this invitation and warning, they inspire that kind of decision to be made. You can encounter these things through terror or fear. You can encounter them through a kind of curiosity and ambitiousness. They are these divisions between two watersheds of human experience, and I leave it very much to the viewer to make that decision, and kind of walking that knife edge is something that I enjoy, and I think that people who appreciate my work understand and enjoy also. That you could slip down into either valley of the human condition. Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time teaching in universities, and it's, teaching and making work are two very different things, and you can be very good at one without being very good at another. To be honest, I've told my students, if there's anything else that you can do, you should go and do that. I would not suggest this life for anyone who I loved or respected. It has moments of very little dignity, and it is a very, very difficult path to follow if you have an easier, more humane option. in. That being said, for the people who are willing to follow it, it has this sense of wonder and possibility that is difficult to find in other places, and profound freedom also. I mean, there's a price and a responsibility that comes along with all of these things. First of all, I would probably be the worst person to speak about my work to students in any setting, or to viewers in any setting, just because my work has such a unique relationship to me, and it emanates from the being side, not the telling side of my character. I don't make work to communicate something. I make work to be something. It's a very important distinction sort of in my relationship to it, that as soon as it leaves my studio and ends up on a gallery floor or in a slide deck for a university lecture sometime, then the assumption is that it's telling something. So in many ways, I would be the one person who should not be talking about what it tells. I mean, it's turned over then to literally everyone else on the planet, and it fundamentally belongs to them and to you at that point. I am lost in some ancient civilization from which this artifact came, and its meaning now belongs to the current civilization that has uncovered it. I don't know. I don't know what's more interesting, or it's probably equally interesting, just for two different reasons. You look at ancient Minoan artifacts, and we tell wonderful, fanciful stories, and we understand a great deal of it, but I'm sure it's vastly different from if we had an ambassador who had lived in that time, what they would say about it. And the question is there any relevance? Just because it had a certain relevance to that society, does it have any relevance to this one? And which story is more interesting or more productive? But I think leaving my work as a question rather than an answer is probably how I would hope it would be presented in that or any other context.
Your art is a juxtaposition of what is considered an ideal world, and you are showing that on the other side. Much darker, with a lot of dark humor, dark sarcasm, but your art seems to be actually a reflection of the ideal world.
Yeah, it's a very astute observation. I don't know if I could say it any better than you have there. It's an artifact from some imagined parallel world in which things are entirely the same and entirely different. And, like you or I, we look in a mirror and it shows us, but it shows us inverted. It's why we look so different from our photographs, is we are used to seeing the mirror image of ourselves, not ourselves, right? And so a lot happens in the kind of transliteration or translation between the real world and these objects that have, again, a real world presence. Sculpture has this wonderful power to exist, like any other object in the real material presence. So it has an immediacy and an authority. But it also comes from this imagined civilization that is us and not us at the same time. And, the separation, kind of the matter-antimatter relationship between those two things is really a wonderful place to play, But again, I would defer to your articulation of it much, much better than mine.
Even your sign, extinct, actually it means memento mori.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's true. Yeah.
How did you come up with that one?
This guy here. Yeah, just playing, I guess. At least in North America here, those ubiquitous exit signs that we're so used to seeing, they're being phased out in favor of the European little green character running, because I think it doesn't depend on sort of an English lexicon to understand it's a pictograph that's easier to understand. So those exit signs are themselves going extinct. And just also this notion, it's always posted over an egress, over a door. You are about to become extinct in the space that you just exit. Again, depending on how it's situated, how it's installed, and the rest of it, it has a resonance that rings louder or softer. It's just, yeah. But again, a memento mori is a great way to articulate it.
Artwork is often accompanied by short essays, short paragraphs of how you perceive things, or even, for example, lacuna. You're giving the definition.
Yeah, it's true. And I think, when I'm no longer to wield all of my tools, I'll do drawing. And when I'm not able to do drawing anymore, then I'll do more writing. I kind of got to organize a landing strip for myself here. But articulating things in spoken or written language, it's just another plane of focus on which the work can exist. I make sculpture because it draws to a focus in the physical material language of the world. Some things work much better as drawings. They focus on the field of the page, and then others kind of project through that into the world of speech or writing. And I think there's a reality to these ideas or these entities that are the work that can be projected onto different surfaces and manifest themselves in different forms. Like writing about a sculpture gives a very different impression than looking at the sculpture, than climbing on the sculpture, or looking at the drawing from which the sculpture was made, or the drawing that was made of the sculpture. And so there's kind of this environment, this ecosystem. And again, going back to this hunter-gatherer wandering through an ecosystem, there are all these different strata or layers of existence of an idea, and whether it manifests as a sculpture or a piece of writing, neither of those are necessarily mutually exclusive. I try to stay away from, grant and grant proposals, because no grant proposal has ever generated any really interesting work, at least from my perspective. Those things would just stay as written words. But those little paragraphs that I write about the work that I've made or I'm in the process of making, it kind of comes from the same place. They're two bandwidths that you can tune into individually. So it feels very much like it is somehow of the same material as the work that ends up as physical sculpture. It just comes out as pencil or as keys on the keyboard, but it has the same ancestor. So I try to keep them short and kind of focused, because if you write too much about it, then it becomes its own thing. The idea separates from what it's referencing, and then it becomes a piece of writing as opposed to this very close kind of shadow or projection of the work itself. So, it is something that I enjoy doing. I don't have to store it. You know what I mean? It's ephemeral in that way. I'm grateful when it contributes, or it opens a little window into the work that people can gain a foothold, or this little moment of additional understanding, because I think quite often there's not a full literacy about the material language that is used, and a little bit of text hopefully gets the viewer just started maybe in the right direction, or in a direction that I think can be generate a productive relationship with the work itself. I don't know if I have anything. I'm terribly unstrategic when it comes to this stuff.
I think people like the fact that you are very spontaneous and you don't come prepared.
Again, to use the boxing analogy, I'm a much better counterpuncher. I'm much better at responding to a situation than I am at preparing for it in some ways. I like leaving that adventure open. I really enjoy kind of your perspective on things and the conversation that you bring. Because I exist in relationship to my tools and my materials and my work, and that kind of dialectic, that conversation is where interesting things happen. And hopefully there's a similar conversation between the work and the viewer. There's an exchange, and there's kind of a mutual drawing into reality and drawing out of their best selves, and so having a conversation with you or someone who has a familiarity or an interest or a literacy with my work and what informs it, it's a rare pleasure. So thank you very much for looking me up.
you seem to be going a lot into this scrapyard and working with a lot of heavy machinery. How do you protect yourself?
I don't. This is the whole point. I have a pair of welding flip-flops. It's dangerous for me to work with a level of protection because it puts you to sleep. You know, if you need the guard on the tool, you probably shouldn't be using the tool. You know, this notion of risk or the adjacency of risk is very, very important because it keeps me sharp and aware. And, you know, I still have all my fingers and my toes and both eyes and the rest of it. So for as long as I'm good enough or lucky enough to keep doing the work that I do in the way that I do it, and I'm not reckless, and I've got a son now, so I've got to set a good example, you know, eyes, ears, that kind of stuff. But again, we are so preoccupied with safety and preservation that we forget what it is that we're protecting or keeping safe, you know? And I'm much more interested in that question than in the other one. So yeah, there's definitely a risk that and again, I'm profoundly fallible and I'm wrong all the time. So, you know, if I lose digits or a limb because I'm an idiot, then, you know, I will take full responsibility for that. But so far I have understood and correctly managed, you know, the risks that I encounter, and I think because of how I engage with them, it allows me to make the work that I make. So I'm excited to be living this life that I'm living and making the work that comes sort of as an accident from it. And so as long as I'm fair and responsible and kind to the people who are around me and depend on me, and I keep making interesting kind of ambitious work that's worth looking at, that's really all I hope. And what happens. The rest is, you know, I abide.